February 26, 1945 dawned cold and bitter over the shattered streets of Cologne, where Unteroffizier Klaus Bergmann sat inside his Tiger I heavy tank, convinced of his invincibility. The 46-ton behemoth beneath him represented the pinnacle of German armored engineering. Its 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at distances exceeding 2,000 meters. Klaus and his crew had survived 3 winters on the Eastern Front, their thick steel armor deflecting Soviet shells like rain against a cathedral roof. Now transferred west to stem the American tide, they believed no enemy armor could challenge their supremacy. The German tank doctrine had been built on this assumption. Training manuals assured crews that American Shermans posed minimal threat, their 75mm guns barely scratching Tiger armor even at point-blank range. Intelligence reports mentioned nothing about any American heavy tanks that could rival German engineering. As Klaus peered through his commander's cupola at the ruined cityscape, watching American infantry picking through rubble 500 meters distant, he felt the familiar surge of predatory confidence. His gunner, Feldwebel Ernst Müller, had knocked out 17 Allied tanks since Normandy. Their loader, young Heinrich Schmidt, could chamber rounds with mechanical precision even under the most intense fire. The driver, Corporal Otto Richter, could maneuver their massive tank through impossibly narrow streets. They were survivors, professionals, veterans of 100 engagements. According to military historian Steven Zaloga's research documented in Armored Thunderbolt, German tankers in early 1945 maintained an almost mystical belief in their technical superiority, even as the Reich crumbled around them. Klaus checked his watch. 0800 hours. The Americans had been probing their position since dawn, testing German defenses with infantry and light armor. Standard procedure for the cautious Americans, Klaus thought. They would send waves of expendable Shermans, which his Tiger would methodically destroy until the Americans withdrew or called in their overwhelming air support. It was a formula that had repeated itself across France, Belgium, and now Germany itself. But something felt different this morning. The American infantry wasn't behaving normally. Instead of advancing in force, they seemed to be pulling back, ting corridors through the rubble. Klaus felt his stomach tighten. Were they making way for something? Achtung! Ernst whispered from the gunner's position, his eye pressed against the telescopic sight. Movement. 300 meters, coming around the cathedral ruins. Klaus swung his binoculars toward the indicated position. What emerged from behind the shattered stonework made his breath catch. The tank rolling into view was unlike any Sherman he had encountered. Longer, lower, with a turret that spoke of serious firepower. Its hull design suggested weight and armor. Was ist das? Heinrich murmured from his loader's position. Klaus felt the first cold finger of doubt touch his spine. German intelligence had failed them before, most catastrophically with the Soviet 34 tank at the war's beginning. Could they have missed something this significant? The unknown American tank pivoted, its long gun barrel swinging with deliberate menace toward their position. The tank commander observing Klaus Bergmann's Tiger through his periscope was First Lieutenant John Grimball of the 3rd Armored Division, and he knew exactly what his Pershing could do. His tank, officially designated the T-26E3 before production standardization, mounted a 90mm high-velocity gun that had been specifically designed to defeat heavy German armor. The Americans had rushed its deployment with only 20 Pershings reaching Europe by February 1945, and their capabilities remained largely unknown to German commanders. Grimball had trained on the Pershing for only 6 weeks at Fort Knox, Kentucky, before shipping overseas. The tank's development had been plagued by bureaucratic delays and competing priorities, with many Army ordnance officials arguing that the Sherman was adequate for European combat. They had been catastrophically wrong. Grimball had lost 3 crews under his command to German heavy tanks during the Ardennes offensive, men burned alive in Shermans whose armor might as well have been cardboard against German guns. The Pershing represented redemption, a response to the terrible arithmetic that had seen American tank crews die 5-1 against Tigers and Panthers. His crew was equally green with the new tank. Corporal Mike Zadarozny on the gun, Private John DeRiggi loading, Technician 5th grade William McVeigh driving, and Corporal Clarence Smoyer as assistant driver and bow gunner, according to reports preserved in the United States Army Center of Military History Archives. The Pershing mounted the 90mm M3 gun, derived from anti-aircraft artillery, capable of penetrating 160mm of armor at 1,000 meters with its MAE, Tie-2 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap ammunition. The classified penetration tables Grimball had studied showed this was more than sufficient to defeat Tiger I frontal armor at combat ranges. But the German crews didn't know this. Their intelligence had failed to account for American tank development accelerating under combat necessity. The Pershing's existence had been kept relatively quiet, with no fanfare accompanying its deployment. German tactical manuals captured just weeks earlier still advised that American tanks posed minimal threat in direct engagements. This information asymmetry would prove deadly. Range 300 yards, Grimball called to his crew through the intercom. Tiger 1, hull down position, 11 o'clock. Through his scope, Zadarozny could see the German tank's commander scanning with binoculars, still unaware of the danger. The Pershing's appearance must have been confusing, not matching any silhouette in German recognition manuals. "He doesn't know what we are," Zadarozny muttered. "He's about to learn," Grimball replied. "Load armor piercing." DeRiggi slammed the heavy round into the breech with practiced efficiency, the smell of gun oil and metal sharp in the cramped turret. The tactical situation was delicate. The Tiger held a defensive position with excellent fields of fire down the primary avenue of approach. Its 88mm gun could destroy the Pershing if it scored a solid hit on critical components. The Pershing's armor, while superior to the Sherman's, was not invulnerable. Grimball's advantage lay in surprise and the unknown lethality of his main gun. The Germans had grown complacent facing Shermans, often exposing themselves to take shots they knew the American tanks couldn't effectively return. This tactical arrogance, born from 2 years of armor superiority, was about to cost them everything. "Steady," Grimball commanded as McVeigh positioned the tank for the optimal firing angle. The Pershing's gyroscopic stabilizer, a significant technological advantage, allowed accurate fire even while moving, though Grimball preferred a stationary shot for this critical engagement. Through his periscope, he could see the Tiger's gun beginning to traverse toward them. The man crew had identified them as a threat, but their response seemed almost leisurely, the confidence of veterans who had destroyed dozens of Allied tanks. They were still calculating based on Sherman combat parameters, expecting to have ample time to acquire and destroy the target before facing effective return fire. That miscalculation would last exactly 3 more seconds. Klaus Bergmann's training screamed at him to fire first, but professional curiosity held his command for a fatal heartbeat. The unknown American tank sat partially exposed 290 meters away, presenting a 3/4 frontal aspect. Ernst had the target acquired, his hand resting on the firing mechanism, waiting for Klaus's command. The range was almost point B, lank by Tiger standards, a guaranteed kill once they fired. But Klaus wanted to identify this new adversary, to report back to battalion headquarters about American tank developments. This hesitation, this brief indulgence of tactical intelligence gathering over immediate violence, violated every principle of armored combat. In tank versus tank warfare, the first round fired generally determined survival. Klaus had learned this on the Kursk salient in the summer of 1943, where he had seen Tigers destroyed by inferior Soviet tanks that had simply shot first from ambush positions. Yet here he was, pausing, studying, trying to memorize details of the enemy vehicle for his after-action report. The American tank's gun barrel appeared massive, suggesting caliber far exceeding the Sherman standard, 75mm. Its turret design indicated thick armor protection. The hull sat low and wide, speaking to substantial weight. "Feuer," Klaus finally commanded, but his 1-second delay had already sealed their fate. Ernst Müller's finger tightened on the firing mechanism, just as the American tank's gun erupted with a brilliant muzzle flash. The Tiger's 88mm gun discharged simultaneously, both rounds crossing in midair with combined velocity exceeding 3,000 feet per second. The Tiger's round struck the Pershing's frontal armor at the junction between hull and turret, a potentially catastrophic hit. Inside Grimball's tank, the impact sounded like God's ham, ere against an anvil, the entire vehicle shuddering from the kinetic energy transfer. For a moment suspended outside time, the American crew waited for the secondary explosion that would mean penetration, fire, death. It never came. The Tiger's armor-piercing round, fired slightly low in Ernst's haste, had struck at an oblique angle against the Pershing's sloped armor. The American tank's metallurgy, benefiting from advanced alloy techniques developed during the war, held firm. The round deflected upward, gouging a deep scar across the armor but failing to penetrate. Inside the Tiger, Klaus had no time to observe his round's effect. The American shell struck their tank's frontal armor just to the right of the bow machine gun mounting, precisely where the armor plates joined. The 90mm M82 round, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second with a hardened tungsten carbide penetrator, punched through the Tiger's armor as though it were sheet metal. The physics of armor penetration are brutal and unforgiving. The American round's kinetic energy, focused on a projectile barely wider than a man's thumb, created pressures exceeding 500,000 pounds per square inch at the impact point. The Tiger's armor, rated to defeat Soviet 76mm guns and American 75mm guns, had no answer to this magnitude of force. Steel failed catastrophically. The armor plug driven inward became a secondary projectile itself, traveling through the crew compartment at supersonic velocity. The round continued through, its energy barely diminished, striking stored ammunition racks behind the driver's position. Otto Richter died instantly, never seeing what killed him, his body pulped by the passing projectile. The ammunition detonation followed milliseconds later, an explosion that turned the Tiger's interior into an inferno. 19 rounds of 88mm ammunition cooked off simultaneously, each explosion feeding the next in a cascading fireball. Klaus Bergmann's last conscious thought was confusion, an inability to process that their impregnable Tiger had been defeated so completely, so denly. Ernst Müller screamed once before the overpressure ruptured his lungs. Heinrich Schmidt, positioned near the turret rear, had a fraction of a second longer to understand his death was coming. The Tiger's turret lifted 6 inches off its ring from internal pressure before settling back down, smoke and flame gouting from every opening. The destruction of Klaus Bergmann's Tiger sent shockwaves through German defensive positions that transcended mere tactical calculations. Wehrmacht doctrine, built on armor superiority since the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940 and 1941, had created a psychological fortress, as impregnable as the Tiger's steel plates. German tankers believed with almost religious conviction that their heavy armor rendered them effectively untouchable by American tanks. This belief system, reinforced by countless engagements where Shermans died helplessly against German guns, formed the emotional bedrock of armored operations in the war's final months. Now, in one thunderous exchange lasting less than 3 seconds, that entire worldview had shattered. Oberst Hans Dietrich, commanding the 6th Panzer Battalion positioned 3 blocks from the engagement, heard the distinctive crack of the Tiger's 88 followed immediately by an unfamiliar report from an unknown weapon. Then came the secondary explosions, the unmistakable sound of catastrophic munition detonation. Dietrich grabbed his radio handset demanding situation reports from Klaus's tank. Silence answered. Through his field glasses he could see black smoke rising from the Tiger's position. His mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Tank destroyers. But American tank destroyers rarely operated in urban terrain. Artillery strike. No artillery preparation had preceded the engagement. Another Tiger, commanded by Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer, sat 200 meters from the burning wreck. Friedrich had witnessed the entire engagement through his commander's periscope, and what he saw violated every principle of armored combat he had learned since 1941. The American tank, whatever it was, had defeated Klaus's Tiger frontally, in clear conditions at medium range. This should have been impossible. Sherman tanks could occasionally achieve kills against Tigers through superior numbers and flanking maneuvers, attacking weak rear or side armor. But frontal penetration at 300 meters? Friedrich's crew sat paralyzed, ed with uncertainty, their faith in armor supremacy crumbling like the cathedral ruins surrounding them. "What are our orders, Herr Hauptmann?" his gunner asked, voice tight with suppressed panic. Friedrich stared at the unknown American tank which had reversed behind cover after its devastating shot. Standard doctrine dictated aggressive counterattack, closing with the enemy to use superior optics and gunnery training. But doctrine had been written assuming German armor superiority. What did you do when the fundamental assumptions under Q or lying tactical theory proved catastrophically false? Friedrich had survived 3 years of combat by trusting his training and his tank's capabilities. Now both seemed inadequate against this new threat. According to historical records maintained by the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, German after-action reports from late February 1945 show increasing references to heavy American tanks and desperate requests for tactical guidance on engaging them. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate battlefield commanders. German intelligence officers, receiving garbled radio reports about American heavy tanks destroying Tigers frontally, initially dismissed the accounts as combat stress or exaggeration. Surely Allied heavy tanks would have been identified before reaching frontline deployment. The failure of German intelligence to detect or adequately assess the Pershing's capabilities represented a catastrophic breakdown in operational awareness. This failure had precedent. German intelligence had similarly failed to anticipate the Soviet 34 tank in 1941, leading to desperate tactical adjustments and crash programs to develop heavier German armor. But German, in 1945, lacked the industrial capacity and time to respond to new threats. The Pershings represented the tip of an American industrial spear that German manufacturing, devastated by strategic bombing and resource shortages, could never match. For tankers like Friedrich Bauer, this reality transformed every engagement into a lottery of survival. If American heavy tanks could destroy Tigers frontally, then armor warfare had become asymmetrical in favor of the Americans. The psychological comfort of superior protection evaporated, replaced by the paranoia that had plagued Allied tankers for 2 years. Every street corner might hide a tank capable of killing you before you could effectively respond. Every long sight line became a shooting gallery where American guns now held advantage. Friedrich made his decision. "Driver, reverse. We withdraw to secondary positions." His crew obeyed with visible relief, the Tiger backing through rubble-strewn streets toward fallback positions 5 blocks east. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself across the Cologne engagement and subsequent battles. German tank crews, encountering Pershings or even suspecting their presence, began exercising uncharacteristic caution. The aggressive tactics that had characterized German armor operations, built on confidence in technical superiority, gave way to defensive warfare and retreat. The Americans had finally fielded a tank that could engage German heavy armor on equal or superior terms, and the psychological impact of this development exceeded even its tactical consequences. German tankers who had spent 2 years hunting Shermans like wolves among sheep now found themselves as potential prey. This role reversal, this fundamental shift in the predator-prey dynamic of armored warfare, broke something essential in German tactical morale. Officers who had built careers on armor superiority now faced a weapon that invalidated their experience. The Pershing had arrived in too small numbers to fundamentally change the war's trajectory, with Germany's defeat already inevitable by February 1945. But for the tank crews facing these American heavies, the Pershing represented something more psychologically devastating than a battlefield defeat. First Lieutenant John Grimball sat in his Pershing commander's position, hands trembling slightly as adrenaline drained from his system, and allowed himself a moment of savage satisfaction. For 20 months, American tank crews had fought German armor with inadequate equipment, dying in Shermans that the troops had bitterly nicknamed Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up so easily when hit. Grimball had attended memorial services for 17 men from his battalion, boys from Nebraska and Michigan and Georgia, who had burned to death because Army ordnance bureaucrats had insisted the ermine was sufficient. He had written letters to their mothers, carefully avoiding any mention of how helpless their sons had been against tigers and panthers, how they had essentially been sent to fight heavy tanks with medium tanks, an asymmetry that cost American lives with ruthless efficiency. Now, finally, American tankers had a weapon that could meet German heavy armor on equal terms. The smoking Tiger 300 meters distant represented more than a tactical victory. It was vindication, proof that American industry and engineering could match German armor technology when properly motivated. Target destroyed, Corporal Zadorozny reported with professional calm that didn't quite mask his excitement. Tiger 1 confirmed kill frontal penetration. Through the periscope, Grimball could see the German tank burning fiercely, its ammunition continuing to cook off with intermittent explosions. The Pershing's development history had been a case study in bureaucratic dysfunction and competing priorities. Initial design work began in 1942, when combat reports from North Africa made clear that American tanks faced significant firepower and armor deficiencies. But development proceeded slowly, hampered by disagreements over specifications, competing resource allocations, and a persistent belief among senior officers that the Sherman remained adequate for European combat. This belief persisted despite mounting evidence to the contrary, despite combat reports detailing German armor superiority, despite casualty statistics that showed American tank crews dying at unsustainable rates when engaging Tigers and Panthers. According to research documented in R.P. Honeycutt's Pershing: A History of the Medium Tank T-20 series, the tank didn't reach standardization for production until March 1944, nearly 2 years after initial design work commenced. Even then, production remained limited, with only 200 units produced before war's end. The first Pershings reached Europe in January 1945, barely 3 months before Germany's final collapse. This timeline meant that thousands of American tankers fought and died in inadequate equipment, while the tank that could have protected them sat in development and production delays. Grimball understood this history intimately, had lost friends to it, and the bitter knowledge informed every engagement he now fought. "Movement 400 yards, another Tiger reversing into cover," Zadorozny called out. Through his commander's periscope, Grimball could see the German heavy tank withdrawing, its commander apparently deciding discretion outweighed valor. This was new. German tankers, supremely confide, and in their armor's protection, typically pressed engagements aggressively, knowing American Shermans couldn't hurt them frontally. The withdrawing Tiger suggested word was spreading about the Pershing's capabilities, that German crews were losing their psychological armor along with their tactical advantage. "Don't engage," Grimball ordered. "Let him go. He'll tell his friends what happened here." This was psychological warfare as much as armor combat. Every German tanker who witnessed a Pershing destroy a Tiger frontally, every crew that withdrew rather than engage, every after-action report detailing American heavy tank capabilities would erode German morale further. The 3rd Armored Division had only 4 Pershings in the Cologne operation, far too few to fundamentally change the tactical situation through firepower alone. But their psychological impact could be leveraged beyond their numbers. German crews who didn't know how many Pershings faced them might hesitate, might withdraw, might surrender initiative that had previously been theirs by default. Private John DeRiggi, the loader, broke the moment of reflection. "Sir, we gonna talk about how their round hit us and didn't punch through?" The crew had felt the Tiger's impact, the massive hammer blow against their frontal armor, and lived to describe it. This experience, surviving a direct hit from a Tiger's 88mm gun, was something American tankers and Shermans rarely achieved. The Pershing's armor, while not as thick as the Tiger's, used soupy, rare metallurgy and sloping to achieve effective protection that could defeat German guns at combat ranges. "Yeah," Grimball replied quietly. "We're going to talk about that." For the first time in the European theater, American tank crews could engage German heavy armor without accepting near-certain death as the price of combat. The Pershing's armor wasn't invulnerable, but it was sufficient. Combined with the 90mm gun's ability to penetrate German heavy tanks frontally, the Pershing represented rough parity with Tigers and Panthers. This parity, This ability to fight and survive against German armor transformed the psychological dynamic of armored koi. Sapi. American crews who had approached every engagement with German heavy tanks expecting to die could now fight with the confidence that their armor might protect them, that their gun could kill their adversary, that superior tactics and crew coordination rather than superior equipment would determine outcomes. By March 19, 1945, barely 3 weeks after the Cologne engagement, Wehrmacht intelligence officers had compiled sufficient reports about American heavy tanks to issue urgent tactical guidance to frontline armor commanders. The directive, preserved in captured German documents now housed at the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, marked a stunning reversal of established doctrine. German tank crews were instructed to avoid frontal engagements with the new American heavy tanks, to prioritize ambush tactics over aggressive assault, and to target the Pershing, inside and rear armor where vulnerabilities remained. This guidance, which essentially advised treating American tanks with the same caution previously reserved for Soviet heavy tanks, like the Joseph Stalin series, represented an acknowledgement that German armor superiority had evaporated. For tank commanders like Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer, who had spent years operating under assumptions of technical dominance, these new instructions required fundamental tactical reorientation. The aggressive maneuver warfare that characterized German armor doctrine, built on confidence that Tigers and Panthers could defeat any opposing armor frontally, gave way to defensive tactics emphasizing concealment and flanking attacks. This shift mirrored the tactical evolution American tankers had undergone in reverse, as Sherman crews learned to survive against superior German armor through superior numbers, air support, and flanking maneuvers. The Pershing's appearance, though limited in numbers, catalyzed broader changes in how both armies approached armored combat in the war's final months. American commanders, emboldened by having a tank that could engage German heavy armor effectively, began employing more aggressive tactics. Tank destroyers, which had previously carried much of the burden of engaging German armor, could now be supplemented by Pershing-equipped units capable of direct assault. This tactical flexibility, combined with overwhelming American numerical and logistical superiority, accelerated Germany's collapse on the Western Front. German commanders, already struggling with fuel shortages, insufficient reserves, and crumbling logistics, now faced an additional burden of psychological uncertainty about armor engagements. The assumption that German heavy tanks could defeat any American armor had been a critical component of defensive planning. With that assumption invalidated, German tactical calculations had to account for the possibility that American spearheads might include tanks capable of destroying Tigers and Panthers frontally. This uncertainty forced more conservative defensive deployments, earlier withdrawals, and a general erosion of the aggressive confidence that had characterized German armor operations even in the war's darkest hours. Oberst Hans Dietrich, whose battalion had lost Klaus Bergmann's Tiger in that first Pershing engagement, noted in his personal diary that encounters with American heavy tanks reminded him of facing Soviet heavy tanks at Kursk, where the comfortable superiority of our Tigers evaporated against the Stalin tanks and their 122mm guns. The tactical revolution extended beyond immediate battlefield encounters to broader operational considerations. American logistics officers, long frustrated by the Sherman's inadequacy against German heavy A or more, began advocating for accelerated Pershing production and deployment. By April 1945, as American forces drove deeper into Germany, the number of Pershings in operational service had increased to approximately 50 units, spread across multiple armored divisions. These tanks, while still vastly outnumbered by Sherman's, were disproportionately assigned to spearhead units where engagement with German heavy armor remained likely. The 3rd Armored Division, which had pioneered Pershing operations at Cologne, developed tactical doctrine specifically for employing their heavy tanks as breakthrough weapons, using the Pershing's superior firepower and protection to crack German defensive positions that would have required multiple Sherman losses to overcome. This doctrine, combining Pershing heavy tanks with Sherman medium tanks and infantry support, represented a maturation of American armored warfare doctrine that synthesized lessons learned from 3 years of combat. The Pershings provided the breakthrough capability and ability to engage German heavy armor, while the more numerous and mechanically reliable Shermans provided operational flexibility and exploitation capability. Lieutenant Colonel Wellborn Griffith, commanding the 33rd Armored Regiment, noted in after-action reports that his 4 Pershings fundamentally changed how we approach defensive positions, knowing we can engage German heavy tanks without accepting catastrophic casualties. For German tankers, the tactical revolution manifested as a slow collapse of the armor-centric defensive strategy that had characterized Wehrmacht operations since the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. With American heavy tanks capable of defeating German armor, and with Allied air superiority making daylight movement suicidal, German tank units increasingly found themselves unable to influence battlefield outcomes despite their technical skill and tactical experience. Friedrich Bauer's Tiger Battalion, which had entered the Cologne defense with 11 operational tanks, had been reduced to 4 by mid-March, with 3 destroyed by Pershings and 4 abandoned due to fuel shortages. His personal experience with the Pershing threat had transformed his approach to armored combat from aggressive to cautious, from predatory to defensive. In his captured post-war debriefing, Bauer reflected that the appearance of American heavy tanks removed our last advantage. We had superior inning, superior tactics, superior gunnery. But when the enemy has equivalent armor and guns and possesses overwhelming numbers and air support, all our skill can do is delay the inevitable. This psychological acknowledgement that German armor supremacy had been the final pillar supporting Wehrmacht effectiveness marked the completion of a mental transformation that the Pershing had initiated with that first devastating shot in Cologne. The German intelligence community's failure to anticipate the Pershing's capabilities or deployment represented one of the war's final critical intelligence breakdowns for the Wehrmacht. German military intelligence, the Fremde Heere West or Foreign Armies West Department, had devoted considerable resources throughout the war to tracking Allied tank development. Intelligence officers maintained detailed technical files on Sherman variants, British Churchill and Cromwell tanks, and Soviet armor developments. Yet the Pershing's development, testing, and deployment to Europe had occurred beneath their operational awareness until the tanks began destroying German heavy armor on the battlefield. This failure had multiple contributing factors, each revealing systemic weaknesses in German intelligence operations by late 1944. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany had severely degraded intelligence collection capabilities, with aerial reconnaissance assets increasingly diverted to defensive operations and intelligence networks in Allied countries, compromised by advancing Allied armies. Major Reinhard Gehlen, commanding Fremde Heere West, later acknowledged in his post-war memoirs that by January 1945, his department's intelligence on Allied armor development was fragmentary and often outdated by months, relying on captured documents and prisoner interrogations rather than systematic technical intelligence collection. The rapid pace of American tank development, accelerated by combat necessity and unlimited industrial capacity, had simply outstripped German intelligence's ability to track and assess new systems before they appeared in combat. The intelligence failure regarding the Pershing mirrored earlier German failures to anticipate Allied technical developments, most notably the failure to predict the Normandy invasion timing and LOC-ation, and the persistent underestimation of Soviet industrial capacity throughout the Eastern Front campaigns. German intelligence analysts, operating within a system that often prioritized politically acceptable assessments over uncomfortable realities, had consistently projected Allied capabilities based on outdated assumptions and wishful thinking. Intelligence reports from late 1944 suggested American armor development remained focused on Sherman variants, with no heavy tank production anticipated before mid-1945 at earliest. These assessments, derived from fragmentary signals intelligence and interrogations of captured American soldiers who themselves knew nothing about Pershing development, created a false sense of security among German armor commanders. When Pershing's began appearing in January and February 1945, the initial battlefield reports were dismissed as misidentification or exaggeration. Only after multiple confirmed engagements including photographic evidence from reconnaissance units, did German intelligence acknowledge that American heavy tank production had reached operational deployment. By then, Germany's collapsing defensive situation left no time or resources for tactical adjustments that might have mitigated the Pershing's impact. According to declassified assessments from the United States Army's Historical Division, German intelligence's failure to detect Pershing deployment was facilitated by successful American operational security and the limited scale of initial deployments. The first Pershings shipped to Europe in January 1945 aboard heavily guarded transport vessels, with documentation deliberately vague about cargo specifications. Units receiving Pershings were instructed to maintain radio silence about their new equipment and to camouflage them when possible to prevent visual identification by German reconnaissance aircraft. This operational security, combined with the Pershing's limited numbers during initial deployment, created a window where American forces possessed heavy tanks capable of defeating German armor. But German intelligence remained unaware of this capability shift. The psychological and tactical advantages of this information asymmetry were substantial, allowing American commanders to employ Pershings as shock weapons whose capabilities surprised and demoralized German tank crews. Even after German intelligence confirmed Pershing deployment, the speed of Germany's collapse prevented effective dissemination of tactical guidance to frontline units. Tank commanders in isolated defensive pockets often fought and died against Pershings without ever receiving intelligence warnings about the new American tank's capabilities, repeating Klaus Bergmann's fatal hesitation as they tried to process an armored threat their training insisted couldn't exist. The intelligence failure extended beyond purely technical assessments to broader strategic miscalculations about American industrial capacity and military adaptability. German intelligence consistently underestimated American ability to identify deficiencies in military equipment and rapidly develop, produce, and deploy solutions. The cultural assumption, prevalent throughout the Wehrmacht, that German engineering superiority represented an insurmountable advantage had blinded intelligence analysts to evidence of American technical innovation. The Pershing's 90mm gun, its advanced armor metallurgy, its mechanical reliability despite rapid development, all testified to American industrial and engineering capabilities that Germany and assessments had systematically undervalued. Major Galen's intelligence summaries from late 1944, declassified decades after the war, show persistent assumptions that American armor development remained constrained by conservative doctrine and limited heavy industry capacity. These assumptions, comfortable and reassuring to German commanders facing overwhelming Allied material superiority, proved catastrophically wrong. The Pershing represented not just a single weapon system, but evidence of American military-industrial complex operating at a scale and speed that German intelligence had failed to comprehend. For German tankers encountering Pershings, this intelligence failure translated directly into tactical surprise, psychological shock, and often death as they faced an adversary whose capabilities exceeded everything their training and intelligence briefings had prepared them to counter. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, roughly 89 Pershings had been delivered to Europe, with fewer than 50 seeing actual combat before the war's conclusion. These limited numbers meant the Pershing's direct tactical impact on defeating Germany remained modest, compared to the thousands of Shermans that constituted the backbone of American armored forces. Yet the tank's psychological and operational impact far exceeded its numerical representation. American tank crews who had endured 2 years fighting German heavy armor with inadequate equipment finally possessed a weapon that could engage Tigers and Panthers on roughly equal terms. This knowledge transformed morale and tactical confidence across American armored units, even those not directly equipped with Pershings. German tank crews, firstly, lost the psychological comfort of armor superiority that had sustained Wehrmacht effectiveness, even as strategic and operational situations deteriorated catastrophically. The Pershing represented the final invalidation of German technical superiority, the last domain where Wehrmacht forces could claim meaningful advantage over their Allied opponents. Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer, who survived the war and spent 3 years in American prisoner-of-war camps, later reflected that encountering the Pershing felt like watching the last foundation of our world crumble. The recognition that even our engineering excellence, our tank design superiority, had been matched and perhaps exceeded by American industry, we had dismissed as incapable of quality weapons production. Historical analysis of the Pershing's combat record shows its crews achieved a favorable kill-to-loss ratio against German armor, with documented destruction of multiple Tigers, Panthers, and numerous lighter German vehicles at the cost of minimal Pershing losses. The 3rd Armored Division's after-action reports, preserved in the National Archives, document their 4 Pershings destroying 23 German armored vehicles during the Cologne operation alone, including 3 Tigers and 7 Panthers without suffering any Pershing losses to enemy action. This success rate reflected both the tank's technical capabilities and the tactical advantages of surprise and information asymmetry. German crews encountering Pershings often hesitated, attempting to identify the unknown tank type and assess its capabilities, exactly as Klaus Bergmann had hesitated in that first fatal engagement. This hesitation, measured in seconds but critical in armored combat's brutal mathematics, consistently favored Pershing crews who understood their weapons' capabilities and employed it with tactical confidence. The psychological dimension of these engagements, German crews fighting an opponent whose capabilities exceeded their intelligence briefings while American crews finally possessed adequate equipment, influenced outcomes as significantly as technical specifications. Lieutenant John Grimball's Pershing, the tank that had destroyed Bergmann's Tiger in Cologne, survived the war intact and was eventually displayed at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a testament to both American engineering and the men who had fought in inadequate tanks for too long before adequate equipment arrived. The Pershing story illuminates broader themes about military innovation, bureaucratic inertia, and the human cost of equipment inadequacy. American tank crews had identified the Sherman's deficiencies against German heavy armor as early as North Africa in 1943, with increasingly urgent requests for heavier tanks with more powerful guns transmitted through command channels. These requests encountered bureaucratic resistance, say from Army ordnance officials convinced that the Sherman remained adequate and that heavy tank production would divert resources from other priorities. This institutional inertia cost American lives with brutal efficiency, as Sherman crews fought German heavy armor in tanks they knew were inadequate for the mission. The Pershings rushed DPO. Ointment in early 1945 represented the Army's belated acknowledgement of these deficiencies, but it came too late for the thousands of tankers who had died in Shermans during the preceding 2 years. Post-war assessments and congressional investigations examined this failure, questioning why American industry, capable of producing tanks like the Pershing, had instead prioritized production of inadequate Shermans in vast quantities. The answers revealed complex interactions between doctrine, logistics, industrial capacity, and bureaucratic momentum that together created a system resistant to necessary adaptation despite mounting battlefield evidence. For the German tank crews who survived the war, the Pershing's appearance in combat became a watershed moment in their personal narratives of defeat. These men, who had spent years as predators in armored warfare, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to weapons they had been assured didn't exist. Oberst Hans Dietrich, whose 6th Panzer Battalion had lost multiple Tigers to Pershings during the Cologne fighting, wrote in his post-war memoirs that the psychological impact exceeded the tactical consequences. We had accepted that we would lose the war through numbers, through fuel shortages, through overwhelming Allied air power, Dietrich reflected. What we had not prepared for was losing our last advantage, the knowledge that in tank-to-tank combat, our armor and guns remained superior. The American heavy tanks took even that comfort from us. This sentiment echoed throughout German armored forces in the war's final months, a recognition that technological superiority, the foundation upon which German military doctrine had been constructed since rearmament in the 1930s, had evaporated completely. The Tiger and Panther tanks, which had terrorized Allied armor from Kursk to Normandy, now faced American weapons that could destroy them frontally at combat ranges. This leveling of the technological playing field removed the final justification for continued resistance. the final argument that German skill in engineering might somehow compensate for overwhelming Allied material superiority. The Pershing's combat debut also revealed the critical importance of operational security and information warfare in modern military operations. American forces had achieved a significant advantage simply by deploying a weapons system whose capabilities German intelligence had failed to assess. This info, armation asymmetry, where American commanders understood both their own tanks' capabilities and German tanks' vulnerabilities, while German commanders operated under outdated assumptions about American armor, proved as valuable as any technical advantage. Modern military theorists studying the Pershing's deployment have identified it as an early example of how information dominance can multiply the effectiveness of weapon systems beyond their purely technical specifications. The Pershing, while roughly equivalent to German heavy tanks in a technical sense, achieved outsized impact because it arrived unexpected on the battlefield, forcing German tactical adaptations at precisely the moment when Germany's collapsing military situation left no time or resources for effective response. Lieutenant Colonel William Duncan, commanding the 32nd Armored Regiment, which operated multiple Pershings during the final advance into Germany, noted in his final wartime report that the tank's greatest weapon was the uncertainty it created in German defensive planning, forcing them to respect every American armored thrust as potentially including tanks capable of destroying their heaviest armor. The human dimension of the Pershing story remained its most compelling element across the decades following the war. For American veterans like John Grimball, who survived the war and returned to civilian life in South Carolina, the Pershing represented vindication and redemption after years of fighting with inadequate equipment. Grimball rarely spoke publicly about his combat experiences, but in a 1985 interview with military historians, he acknowledged that commanding a Pershing had transformed his psychological approach to armored combat. For 2 years, every engagement with German heavy tanks meant accepting that boys under my command would probably die, Grimball reflected. The Pershing changed that calculation. We could fight and survive. That knowledge was worth more than all the armor plate and ammunition we carried. For German veterans like Friedrich Bauer, the Pershing became symbolic of the broader collapse of German military power. The moment when even the domains here Germany retained advantages disappeared beneath the weight of Allied industrial and military superiority. Bauer, who emigrated to Canada after his release from prisoner of war status, and worked as a mechanical engineer until his death in 1993, maintained that the Pershing's appearance marked the psychological end of the war for German tankers, even though fighting continued for months afterward. The technical legacy of the Pershing extended well beyond World War II, informing American tank development through the Cold War era. The Pershing's successful combination of firepower, protection, and mobility established design principles that influenced subsequent American tanks including the M46, M47, and eventually the M48 Patton series. The 90mm gun, proven effective against German heavy armor, remained standard American tank armament through the 1950s until replaced by larger caliber weapons necessitated by Soviet heavy tank development. More importantly, the Pershing's rushed development and limited wartime deployment taught American military planners painful lessons about the dangers of complacency and bureaucratic resistance to innovation. Post-war analyses of American tank development emphasized the need for continuous weapon system evolution and rapid response to battlefield experience. Precisely the adaptability that had been lacking during the Sherman's prolonged production, despite mounting evidence of its inadequacy against German heavy armor. The Korean War, where Pershings performed effectively against Soviet-supplied North Korean armor, validated the design choices made during its wartime development and confirmed that American heavy tank